Hi, all. I hope you're doing well and staying safe. I want to talk today about theories of truth, go through a kind of brief overview of some of the historical developments concerning what philosophers have thought that a theory of truth should do, and what theory is most plausible. I want to begin with a, a kind of informal and sort of playful text that engages with some of these questions about the nature of truth. At first, like a little subtly, but it gets into questions of entailment and contradiction, paradox, etc. So this is from Raymond Smullyan's What is the Name of This Book? And Ed will be playing the part of Raymond.
My introduction to logic was at the age of 6. It happened in this way. On April 1st, 1925, I was sick in bed with the gripe or flu or something. In the morning, my brother Emile, 10 years my senior, came into my bedroom and said, "Well, Raymond, today is April Fool's Day, and I will fool you as you have never been fooled before." I waited all day long for him to fool me, but he didn't. Late that night, my mother asked me, "Why don't you go to sleep?" I replied, "I'm waiting for Emile to fool me." My mother turned to Emile and said, "Emile, will you please fool the child?" Emile then turned to me and said the following dialogue.
So, you expected me to fool you, didn't you?
Yes.
But I didn't, did I?
No.
But you expected me to, didn't you?
Yes.
So I fooled you, then, didn't I?
Well, I recall lying in bed long after the lights were turned out, wondering whether or not I had really been fooled. On the one hand, if I wasn't fooled, then I did not get what I expected. Hence, I was fooled. This was Emile's argument. But with equal reason, it can be said that if I was fooled, then I did get what I expected. So then, in what sense was I fooled? So, was I fooled or wasn't I?
So this case has a lot of the features that we'll see in more significant paradoxes. It seems like there's a plausible case to be made both to the effect that he was fooled and that he wasn't. And yet, quite obviously, these can't both be true at the same time. And some of the ways of kind of treating of paradox we can see similar responses to here. For instance, one way of kind of approaching this puzzle is to suggest that, well, we might distinguish between different meanings of fooled, and perhaps in one sense he was fooled and in another not. But those being two different meanings, then it's not the case in the same sense that he was both fooled and not fooled. He's, say, fooled in the first sense, but not in the second, or vice versa. And thus you don't have a case in which you say, sort of simpliciter, he was both fooled and not fooled. That contains a contradiction, and so can't be true. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the major kind of theories of truth that have been advocated, talk about some kind of brief historical commentary on it, and we'll talk about one applied case, what's called the liar's paradox, and briefly sketch out an approach to that that was pursued by Alfred Tarski. So the animating question here is, how is it that we should think about the nature of truth? What does it mean to say that a particular statement is true? And what are the kinds of things to which truth applies? Can you say, like, or rather, there are cases in which somebody might say, well, like, you are a true friend, or this is, like, true soap, or something of the sort. And this is often, like, a bit different than, or they'll say, like, be true to yourself. These are uses of the word true that don't always, like, seem to cohere well with a particular kind of formalized and comprehensive framework. And it's not always clear that we can't just simply paraphrase those away and better articulate what we mean in those cases. Where when you say, like, this person is a true friend, you might mean this person lives up to, like, certain desirable standards associated with friendship. You might distinguish between that and between, like, a true friend and one that is not a true friend, or, like, is a fake friend. One might think that true applies to particular sentences, but quite plausibly, it applies to something like the informational content that is expressed by a particular sentence. So, if it's, for instance, true in English that snow is white, then it should be true in Spanish that la nieve es blanca, or in German that die Schnee ist weiß. A kind of case study to think about some further contours of truth. So, in June 2004, a Belgian jury found Marc Dutroux guilty of murder, and this case dragged on for almost 10 years. And during this time, there were two fairly significant witnesses who were asked about whether one sent and the other received a case. Under oath, this policeman, Lesage, testified that he had sent the file to the judge, who must have received it. The judge, also under oath, asserted vehemently that the file was not sent to him, and so he did not receive it. And in newspaper coverage of this, a journalist for Le Soir wrote, "The confrontation between Officer Lesage and Judge Dutroux was stimulated by an almost ultimate search for truth. Does truth exist?" And this anthropologist, Winken, responds, "I think that all the work of the commission is based on a sort of presupposition that there exists not a truth, but the truth, which, if one presses hard enough, will finally come out. However, anthropologically, there are only partial truths, shared by a larger or smaller number of people, a group, a family, a firm. There is no transcendent truth. Therefore, I don't think that Judge Dutroux or Officer Lesage are hiding anything. Both are telling their truth. Truth is always linked to an organization, depending upon the elements that are perceived as important. It is not surprising that these two people, representing two very different professional universes, should each set forth a different truth." There's a kind of deep mistake that is made here. Because whereas in the previous case, like, the kind of conflict that emerged really had to do with what it is we mean by fooled. But here, the question is not about the meaning of any particular term, but whether or not some particular concrete event came to pass, whether this file was transmitted from the police officer to the judge. And so this can't be resolved by, or it can't be adequately or satisfactorily resolved in a practical sense by playing with, say, the meaning of the term delivered or submitted. Here the question is whether the relevant information was transferred from one to the other. And if there's a matter of divergence in belief here, then it can't be the case that both are telling the truth. There is a truth that, or there is a truth that is independent of belief. And the kind of problem with the sort of theory of truth expressed by Winken here seems to be that it collapses the notion of truth onto that of belief, because it doesn't seem like Winken's account can give any sort of useful notion of what is false. It seems like he might be pushed to say, well, it's, say, false for the police officer that he didn't submit it, and false for the judge that he received it. But this isn't very useful in terms of distinguishing beliefs which are worth keeping and those which are worth abandoning. And to say that something's true is, by most philosophical accounts, stating that something holds independently of any particular person's belief. If it's true that, say, a particular block has a certain mass, then it doesn't depend on whether, say, you believe that or I believe that in order for it to be true. The kinds of things that are classically thought to be the bearers of truth value are what are called propositions. This is something like the meaning of a sentence. So a sentence in a particular natural language, say English, Chinese, German, French, Spanish, etc., all contain particular ways of expressing certain informational content. It's that informational content that can be expressed by multiple means that is the thing that is true or not. So one can express a belief or a statement that is false. To say it is false is, on some accounts, to say that it does not accurately represent the world, or it doesn't correspond to it. So one kind of minimal account of truth that is fairly close to the idea expressed by Tarski is that we can begin to understand truth in a fairly kind of minimal way. By, say, identifying the conditions under which the claim snow is white is true. And he says that's true if and only if snow is white. And initially that might seem like he hasn't told you anything at all, but notice that we have here is a linguistic object, this utterance, or the sentence token. And this is we can call a state of affairs, or a way things can be. And so snow is white could be replaced with other semantically equivalent linguistic utterances like La nieve es blanca. And that will have the same truth conditions as its other semantically equivalent utterances. Yeah.
So
You had a question?
it sounds like kind of like the sort of difference that's happening here is like in there's a concrete matter of truth, like whether a document got delivered, and then there's sort of a less harder, more kind of there's a less sort of verifiable version of truth, like, oh, did he get fooled or did he not get fooled? And it's like I guess the state of the. Sorry.
Yeah. So in the case of the disagreement between the police officer and the judge, the question is about whether like a particular sort of like concrete object has reached a certain place, essentially, whether it's reached the office of the judge. In the case of the issue with Raymond and Emile, the question is, well, what is the meaning of fooled? And the latter question is relevantly more abstract. It because there's different ways in which you could define fooled, and depending on which of those you select, then you get a differing answer with regards to whether or not he was fooled. Whereas you don't have the same kind of like variability, presumably, in the case with the police officer and the judge. Here, where we're talking about the linguistic object, you could interpret that as just a kind of concrete mass of ink or of pixels in this case. But that's going to fail to capture all of the sort of significant ways in which that object relates to other objects in the language, and it'll fail to be able to capture by itself sort of like the cognitive significance of that. So you might think,
just to expand it,
yeah,
snow is white if snow is white, because
also
we have the idea that we can say snow is white because there's an idea of snow and there's an idea of white. That's like a very simple breakdown of it. But like the idea of like you got fooled if, instead of like snow is white if snow is white, you got fooled if you got fooled. There's the second half of that if is unsolvable in the second. Whereas with the judge, you know, the document was either received and it kind of is solvable. So the document was received if the document was received, or if the document was not, you know? Or am I...
So if you like set a particular meaning for fooled, then you can get like a determinate truth value that he was fooled or he wasn't. And so you can solve for it like insofar as you have a determinate meaning associated with it. What we have here is it's not even necessarily an idea. And the way that Tarski develops this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, he thinks that these terms have extensions. And so they don't necessarily contain any sort of like representational content. So he thinks like snow is a term and white is a term, or snow is a singular term, is white is a particular kind of predicate, and so snow refers to the substance. Is white then contains, it can be understood as a set or a collection of objects, and it will contain within what is called its extension all of the objects which meet some relevant criteria, and so it'll be all the objects that are white in this case. So this doesn't require any sort of like representational functions necessarily. There's disputes in the philosophy of language about whether these terms have like merely referential or also representational functions associated with them. Tarski's approach in the 1930s and 40s was to develop, at the very least, the sort of like the machinery of a language that operated primarily on the basis of extension rather than any kind of representational thing or intention. So one way in which we can kind of think about truth is using some of that, what's called the subject and predicate analysis, or predicate logic. And what predicate logic aims to do is to provide a very sort of comprehensive and neat way of taking particular sentences in natural language, like English, and identifying exactly what sort of commitments those have, what they are committed to the existence of, and then characterizing those objects in terms of properties and relations. properties and relations are both types of predicates. And you can think of a predicate in kind of very general terms as a characteristic of an object. This will be what's called a one-place predicate or property, or a relation. This will be a two or more place predicate. So, for instance, here's the relation is to the north of, and you can plug in then two what are called subjects or singular terms. So LA is to the north of San Diego. And so the idea is that you can analyze a lot of descriptive sentences in terms of subject and predicate. So if I say I am right-handed, then the subject of that sentence is I, and the predicate will be is right-handed. And this won't be able to perfectly capture all aspects of our language. There's areas where predicate logic falls short, but it's far more powerful than what's called sentential logic, which was its sort of primary predecessor. We can, in the context of predicate logic, there are what are called quantifiers, and when you use a predicate, but you don't want to specify a particular object, some determinate one, you want to say rather there are some things that have this attribute. There are, say, some dogs, or there are some dogs that are nice. Then you want to say, well, there exist some things, or there exists something. And so you make use of what's called the existential quantifier. And there's also the universal quantifier, this upside down A, and this captures the logic of everything or all. It's a universal quantifier. So we won't go too much into the mechanics of that, but having a kind of general idea of that can be helpful. So we can analyze the truth of a claim like Max is a dog by, say, identifying the predicate is a dog, and then determining whether there's an object that falls under that, namely Max. If there is, then the statement's true. If not, then it's false. So singular terms are those that refer to particular objects. So say like George, the term may be referentially ambiguous because there's multiple people that could possibly refer to, but in the context of predicate logic, the idea is you have some particular name and it refers to some particular object. It refers directly to that thing. And terms like Los Angeles and San Diego, note here the boundaries are less precise, but this isn't a particular unique problem. You'll have problems like that for ordinary objects and persons too. When we use quantifiers, we also use variables. So we say there exists some x such that x is a dog, or in fairly bare bones formalism, there exists some x such that px, where px is any property. And okay, x then gets read as x is a p. So if one talks, say, a tree, then they say like there's a tree that has no branches. They haven't necessarily picked out a specific one. They're saying there exists something that is a tree that has the associated property. So predicates can be divided into properties and relations. Properties are one-place predicates. So say George is left-handed will be a property, or left-handedness could be construed as a property. A relation is a predicate that holds between two or more objects, so is to the north of relation. Did you have any questions about? Okay.
Not right now.
Okay, so I want to turn now to some things that have been said about the nature of truth that a lot of theories aim towards consistency with. So Aristotle in the Metaphysics says, to say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is, or to say of what is not that it is not, is true. And this gives us some kind of minimal constraints. Aristotle is having to make a kind of distinction, or he's having to recognize sort of the connection here between language and the world, and the sort of inferential relations between truth and falsity. If something is false, then it's not true, and vice versa.
Let's read that again. To say of what is that is not.
That it is not.
That it is not. To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. While to say of what is that it is, and what is not that it is not, is true.
No.
The it kind of confused me, but it sounds like he's saying to say something exists that doesn't exist, or to say something that doesn't exist is false. While to say something that exists does exist, and to say something that doesn't exist is true.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
So, one type of formalized comprehensive theory about the nature of truth, the coherence theory of truth, says that we can judge, or rather a particular proposition is true if it coheres with, meaning it's entailed by the remainder of a set of propositions, or it's robustly consistent with that set of propositions. And in a more concrete context, then, a belief is true because it's consistent with and implied or entailed by a set of other beliefs. One of the proponents of this sort of view was Bradley, who claimed truth consists in a fully comprehensive and consistent set of propositions. It's worth noting, one could endorse Bradley's claim here and think that, well, that's a necessary requirement for truth, that of what is true, there is a comprehensive account and that it's consistent, without thinking that this account is sufficient, because in terms of the requirements here, there's nothing about any particular relation to the world for a particular proposition. So if you, say, have a comprehensive description of what is, say, on the table, you could quite plausibly you could take a particular descriptive account, say there are 5 objects on the table, one is a small truck, one is a pen, one is a stapler, etc. And you could say, instead of saying there's a pen, you could say there's an eraser. And both of those descriptions by themselves can be consistent because there's no sort of contradiction entailed in either of those sets of sentences, but they say something quite different about what's on the table. And there's no necessary requirement that the proposition references what is on the table, or more broadly, what is an accurate description of the world. So one might think that coherence is a requirement for truth, but that it is not sufficient. In other words, you can have coherence without having truth. The correspondence theory, which seems to get many seems to be capable of capturing many of our intuitions about the way in which we ordinarily talk about truth a lot of the time, has been motivated by different philosophers over time. Some of the most sort of interesting work was done by the logical atomists during the early part of the 20th century. There's this quote from Russell, and it's in connection with some of the work being done by Ludwig Wittgenstein in the Tractatus and the development of mathematically regimented theory of language. Russell writes, "What is now required is to give the greatest possible development to mathematical logic, to allow to the full the importance of relations, and to then found upon this secure basis a new philosophical logic, which may hope to borrow some of the exactitude and certainty of its mathematical foundation. If this can be successfully accomplished, then there is every reason to hope that the near future will be as great an epoch in pure philosophy as the immediate past has been in the principles of mathematics. Great triumphs inspire great hopes, and pure thought may achieve within our generation such results as will place our time, in this respect, on a level with the greatest age of Greece." So, a kind of brief accounting of some of that idea and the motivations behind it. Logical atomism, on a fairly plausible count, is the view that we should think of the world as the totality of facts, more precisely the totality of atomic facts, where an atomic fact is the sort of smallest object to which the smallest linguistic unit to have a truth value corresponds. So an atomic fact is the sort of object or referent of the simplest descriptive statement that could obtain a truth value. And it is, or the structure of the atomic facts is thought to be mirrored by the structure of our language. And so we can gain an understanding of the structure of the world through an understanding of the structure of our language, was the idea. And so the idea was that we could sort of decompile all of our knowledge into these atomic facts. Say, like an atomic proposition, this object is red. There were various sort of ways in which the early hopes of that movement failed. Russell and at the same time Frege were working on the reduction of all of mathematics down to logic, and due to various sort of paradoxes resulting from principle of naive set theory, it turned out that they weren't able to develop a fully consistent system that reduced mathematics to principles of pure logic. A little bit more on the correspondence theory. So, according to the correspondence theory of truth, we should think of truth as a sort of correspondence, or this relation of, to some extent, mirroring between a proposition as the sort of abstract linguistic object that is tokened or expressed through various instances of natural language on the one hand, and some facts in the world or the matters of what is on the other. Various sort of ways in which the correspondence theory can be expressed. You might say of a particular sentence token, call it T, that it's true in a particular language. L means that it's a sentence token and there's a state of affairs, call that H, such that two conditions obtain. One is that that sentence token, it expresses or means that that sort of state will obtain within the language of L, and that state of affairs does obtain. Chisholm says, a particular sentence of some language is true by definition means that 1, the sentence expresses a state of affairs, and the state of affairs obtains. Or, in short, that a sentence is true if and only if it expresses a state of affairs that obtains in reality. It's worth thinking about how you might understand, then, the truth of the following statement. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. What exactly is it that this sentence corresponds to? It seems that on a kind of flat reading, it's not simply the water that it is corresponding to, but also perhaps the number which stands in a certain relation to the water as well. So the basic sort of contours of the correspondence theory hold that we should think of truth as the sort of value that applies to propositions that are appropriately related to states of affairs in the world. So we can understand truth as this kind of mirroring relation between language and the world. It consists in the propositions corresponding to a particular fact, and the fact is the actual stuff in the world, or how things are. There's various sort of ways in which we might try to further decompile these, but this gives a kind of initial and perhaps on first glance kind of plausible account of what we mean frequently by truth. From Bertrand Russell, some things that he thinks we ought to desire from a theory of truth and ways in which theories might fail. So first he says, our theory of truth must be such as to admit its opposite, falsehood. A good many philosophers have failed adequately to satisfy this condition. They have constructed theories according to which all of our thinking ought to have been true, and have then had the greatest difficulty in finding a place for falsehood. In this respect, our theory of belief must differ from our theory of acquaintance, since in the case of acquaintance, it was not necessary to take account of any of its opposite. So Russell is saying, well, we need a way of distinguishing between true beliefs and false beliefs. And this is a way in which, recall that former example of the dispute between the police officer and the judge, and the commentary by the anthropologist who says, well, it was, both of their claims were true for each of them. And the problem there is, well, it doesn't seem like that way of conceptualizing truth allows a meaningful and useful account by which we can understand what it means for something to be false. Russell's further sort of distinction here between what he calls the theory of belief and theory of acquaintance. He says that we could come to know things on the basis of a sort of immediate experience of a thing, or we could come to know something on the basis of inferences made, or on the basis of information transmitted to us by others. And so what will be true for acquaintance is not going to be exactly mirrored by belief, because if you become acquainted with something in space, say like you bump into a table, then you don't need an account of like false acquaintance, because in such a case we'd simply say that you weren't acquainted with it. Whereas we do need a kind of conception of false belief. Russell says, it seems fairly evident that if there were no beliefs, there could be no falsehoods, and no truth either. In the sense of which truth is correlative to falsehood, if we imagine a world of mere matter, then there would be no room for falsehood in such a world. And although it would contain what may be called facts, it would not contain any truths, in the sense in which truths are things of the same kind as falsehoods. In fact, truth and falsehood are properties of beliefs and statements. Hence a world of mere matter, since it would contain no beliefs or statements, would also contain no truth or falsehood. What Russell is saying here is a little bit more controversial amongst philosophers, and some philosophers will adamantly reject it. Frege is one who we'll see later who does that. Russell's here seeming to suggest that, well, there might be propositions, but they couldn't, or rather, perhaps he thinks there couldn't be propositions either without being thought by someone, so they must come into being. There's different sort of stages in Russell's philosophical development, and this comes from what we might call his more sort of phenomenologist or phenomenalist leaning, where he is inclined to think of truth as constrained by psychology to some extent. There's various reasons for which that may not pan out all that well, and some of those we'll see in the next lecture. But as again what we have just said, it is to be observed that the truth or falsehood of a belief always depend upon something which lies outside of the belief itself. If I believe that Charles I died on the scaffold, then I believe truly, not because of any intrinsic quality of my belief, which can be discovered by merely examining the belief, but because of a historical event which happened 2.5 centuries ago. If I believe that Charles I died in his bed, then I believe falsely, and no degree of vividness in my belief or of care in arriving at it prevents it from being false, again because of what happened long ago, and not because of any intrinsic property of my belief. Hence, although truth and falsity are properties of beliefs, they are properties dependent upon the relations of the beliefs to other things, not upon any internal qualities of the beliefs. So he's saying here that for a belief, or if we want to avoid lapsing into the kind of more psychological approach and just say a proposition, in order for it to be true, it's not about its sort of like internal constitution, but it is about whether it relates to something in the world. If you say it is raining, then your words somehow correspond to the rain, and they're true in the case where it is raining, false in the case where it's not. Russell concludes, thus a belief is true when it corresponds to a certain associated complex, and here he's drawing from what we saw expressed as a logical atomist idea, and false when it does not. Assuming, for the sake of definiteness, that the objects of belief are two terms and a relation, the terms being put in a certain order by the sense of the believing, then if the two terms in that order are united by the relation into a complex fact, the belief is true. So say here that LA is to the north of San Diego. Those LA and San Diego are the two terms. Is to the north of is the relation. And if they is to the north of is an ordered relation, so you can't like swap one out for the other and hope to maintain the same truth value. So if the two terms in that order are united by the relation into a complex fact, such that of the reference of those terms, Los Angeles and San Diego, they do stand in this is to the north of relation, then the belief is true. If not, it is false. This constitutes the definition of truth and falsehood that we were in search of. Judging or believing is a certain complex unity of which the mind is a constituent. If the remaining constituents, taken in the order which they have in the belief, form a complex unity or fact, then the belief is true, and if not, it is false. So a belief is true if and only if the belief relates its objects in the way that they are related by some fact in the world, and a belief is false if and only if the way that the belief relates to its objects is not the way that they are related by any fact in the real world. Questions about any of this?
I guess it seems like, I'm reminded of a recent, you know, do I prefer truth over facts, in the sense of, like, there is a definite a difference between truth and facts, and a relationship there that is kind of
Yeah, so truth is something that applies to propositions or linguistic objects, things that have like a
beliefs.
descriptive value. Yeah, beliefs would also be something.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas like facts are the things in the world. So like if you say like it is 60 degrees out today,
The state of affairs.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the facts consist in the state of affairs. Um, Another early 20th century philosopher, J.L. Austin, said, if there's to be communication of the sort that we achieve by language at all, then it seems there must be two sets of conventions. And here there's a kind of cross section between philosophy of language and philosophies concerning the nature of truth. Um, what he is giving an account of, or what he is trying to examine, is what it seems that our ordinary language sort of necessitates, or the ways in which we use our ordinary language necessitate an account of the functions of that. So he says there seem to be descriptive conventions correlating sentences with types of situation, thing, event, etc., to be found in the world. But there also must be demonstrative conventions associating statements with historical, actual facts, etc., to be found in the world. So these descriptive conventions are concerned with what we might call types. These demonstrative conventions are ways of relating to or referring to particular events. They might use indexical functions like this or that, over here or there. And Austin says, a statement is said to be true when the historic state of affairs to which it is correlated by the demonstrative conventions, the ones to which it refers, is a type with which the sentence used in making it is correlated by the descriptive conventions. So if I say, there's a dog over there, then there's a demonstrative convention that binds my statement to the particular time and place where it's uttered. And there's then these descriptive conventions associated with that that identify under what conditions it's appropriate to say that something is a dog or not. And if the object over there meets the conditions, then the statement will be true. If it does not meet the conditions, then it will be false.
Mm. And that could be whether it's a dog or whether it's over there.
So both of those things would have
like,
to
whether
be
it was
required.
over there, if you had a video of you saying over there, it's like, was it at that particular time? There's like, yeah, okay.
So some challenges that are posed to the correspondence theory. There's the question of what are facts, and whether this could provide you a way of arbitrating between competing theories of what sorts of things exist, whether that ultimately resolves in which types of facts obtain. There's the issue that if we understand truth as a matter of correspondence, then is anything other than that falsehood, or is there some requisite standard that a statement or linguistic object must meet in order to be truth apt in the first place? For instance, if you say "hoo boo boo," then quite plausibly that statement may be neither true nor false. It lacks like sufficient meaning in order to be truth functional. There's the question of how we should sort of understand linguistic conventions associated with truth more broadly. Are there compositional rules that our terms follow such that we can generate truth conditions atomistically and then judge the truth of a statement by judging of the truth functions of its parts, or are truth functions governed by some rules of use, or other questions of the sort? Those are things that might be explored in a more advanced discussion of truth. I want to turn kind of briefly to what's called the liar's paradox and look at a sort of puzzle that arises for theories of truth, and it puts tension on the idea that the correspondence theory, as we've looked at it so far, can be a fully adequate theory of truth. So take as a kind of base case the claim the sentence is false. If we say that that sentence corresponds to something that is the case, then it seems like we should say the sentence is true, but because the sentence says it's false, if it's true, then it's false, and so it can't be the case that it's both true and false, and it seems absurd that if it's true, then it's false. That generates a kind of contradiction. So if we suppose that the sentence is false...
Unless it was autocorrect, of course.
So if we say the sentence is false, then it says it's false, and if it's not false, then it's true. So either way, it seems we end up with a kind of contradiction. That means we have a paradox when we have a case in which the premises seem like quite plausibly true, but they always lead to either a contradiction or they lead to something impossible. Then we have a paradox. This can perhaps be a little bit more easily seen at a kind of second level iteration of the problem, where we use two sentences and we don't deal with a sort of immediate case of self-reference. So take now the two sentences at the bottom of the screen. The sentence to the right is true. This is a perfectly fine sentence. Oftentimes, like, you might use one sentence to refer to another. So there doesn't seem to be any immediate problem here. But when we look to the second sentence, then the sentence to the left is false. Now we have a similar problem to what we have in the first kind of base case. So if we assume that the sentence on the left is true, then that leads us to the conclusion that the sentence on the left is false. And if we assume that the sentence on the left is false, then if it's false, then the sentence on the right is not true. In other words, it's false. And if that means then the sentence on the right, the sentence on the right is going to be false, and the sentence on the right says that the sentence on the left is false. If it's not false, then it's true. But on the assumption then that it's false, we end up with the conclusion that it's true. So this poses a kind of problem, and it seems to put some pressure on the correspondence theory, because it seems, well, does this correspond or not? And there needs to be some further kinds of restrictions that are applied in order to make sense of what is going on here, or to, we might call, dissolve the paradox.
Yeah, it's similar to when Raymond was fooled by his brother, in that, whether he's fooled or not, he was fooled, he wasn't fooled. Both of those things can't be true. And
right.
It seems like it's the same, pretty much a very similar type of thing with those bottom two sentences, and that they both can't be true.
It seems maybe like a little bit worse in this case, because presumably, like, true and false should be like fairly determinate in meaning.
Oh yeah, no, this is definitely worse. The bottom of the current slide is definitely worse in that it's pure logic. It doesn't require any backstory about his brother or anything, except for the idea of right and left. You know,
Right.
unless you question that
Yeah, there's
supposition
no
of
issue of
right,
ambiguity,
So
seemingly.
there's very little ambiguity. This is yeah. Thank you.
So I want to talk about Alfred Tarski's kind of solution to this. There's also non-classical solutions which say that we should say that, well, on the basis of this, there are some statements that are neither true nor false. They have some third truth value. We're not going to explore that solution as much today. It can be noted that you can actually reproduce the paradox of that third level of iteration, because you can get a statement that has that third truth value and doesn't on a set of assumptions. But what Alfred Tarski showed was there are plausibly certain constraints that ought to be applied to our language when we are talking about truth values. And Tarski, beyond his work on the liar paradox, develops one of the most robust kind of early theories of an extensional theory of truth. And there's later ways in which that gets developed in the 20th century. So his idea is fairly complex, and there's a lot of logical machinery that goes into the full sort of proof. I'm going to give you a kind of brief sketch of how he thinks that we can resolve it. So we've been playing around a little bit with this idea of a set. It's a collection of things. There are ordered sets and there are non-ordered ones. The kind of base sets are the non-ordered ones. And when we say that the sentence on the right is true or false, then true and false are properties that apply to sentences. And so whether it's true could be thought of as whether that particular sentence falls under the extension of the predicate true. And what Tarski is going to say is we need to make distinctions between sort of the levels at which languages operate. In that case, we looked at previously where we talked about the linguistic object, snow is white, and the sort of the referent or the substance of that. There is the object is the snow itself. The object language then is that which describes or refers to the snow and the predicate of whiteness. And then when we want to say it's true that snow is white, Tarski says, well, you can't say that within the same language. You need to have a language which talks about that object language, which refers to snow and the predicate of whiteness. And that meta-language can have within it the properties of truth and falsity, and it can apply those properties to its object language, the language it is the meta-language of. So call the object language in this sort of like standard, in this kind of bare bones example, L1, and call the meta-language ML1. So an object language is not allowed to refer to its own sentences, or any language L1 is not permitted to refer to its own sentences, so meta-languages cannot refer to their own sentences either. You have to have a meta-language of that, and so you could refer to the sort of base object language L1, the meta-language of L1, and you could have a meta-language of the meta-language of L1, call that the meta-meta-language. So for any language L1, it can't say of its own sentences that they are true or false. Only the meta-language of that language can say that they are true or false. And Tarski notes then if we apply these constraints, then there is an ambiguity. because, say, we name those sentences. Say, we have the sentence on the right is false. And the sentence on the left is true. So call, say, this one Alice, and this one Bob. And so we can say, we can, for instance, assume that Alice is true. And if Alice is true and it's referring to Bob, then Alice must be in the meta-language of Bob. And if the sentence Bob is making a claim about the truth value of another sentence, then Bob cannot be in the meta-language of Alice, so Bob must be in the meta-language of some other sentence.
And by meta-language, you mean like the idea of like left and true, like the idea of the meta-language being the language that can declare truth about the other language, like L1 and ML1. It's like that's sort of like it makes it.
So ML1 is going to be the meta-language of L1. So if Alice is in the meta-language of L1, say it's an ML1, and Bob is in L1, then Bob has to also be in the meta-language of some other language, so call it ML2, where numbers in meta-languages don't designate any priority relation between them. So ML2 could be the meta-language of, say, like language 3, so long as you don't get any sort of weird relation such that ultimately then Bob could say something about Alice.
So basically, what we're getting to when we talk about ML2, Bob is talking about something else.
Yes, Bob is talking about something else. It can't be the sentence Alice.
In order for Alice to be true, Bob has to be talking about, in fact, we're talking about something else.
Yeah.
And that, okay.
So Bob has to be referring to something else and call that, say, Carol. So Bob's referring to that. Carol doesn't, the sentence Carol that we're sort of supposing hypothetically does not exist. So Bob is false, and because Alice says Bob is false, then Alice ends up true in that case. If we start from the other direction and say, suppose that Bob is in the meta-language of Alice, and Alice is in the meta-language of some other language, then because Alice says some sentence is false and that sentence doesn't exist, then Alice would end up being false and Bob would end up being false. But either way, you don't generate the contradiction that way.
I see.
Okay, so that concludes this kind of brief discussion of some theories of truth and this kind of brief examination of Tarski's way of solving the liar's paradox. And next time we'll be talking a little bit about Frege and the way in which he argues that we ought to think about the nature of truth and of propositions more generally. Okay. See you all next time.